Okay, I think we're good. Hello, everybody. And somebody put in the chat if it sounds okay. I would appreciate that. I apologize for the technical errors. Thank you, Sarah and team. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. I know this is a quick session and we've lost some time, so I'll do what I do best, which is probably talk just a little faster. My name is Laura Dietrich, and you can read my bio in your program, and I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm a professor at the University of San Diego, where I manage our programs in nonprofit leadership and management, and focus a lot of my work on governance and boards. So today we're kind of looking at the fundraising element through the lens of the board, and I wanted just to share some data and information with you. I'm going to acknowledge up front that this is a Western-based approach. The work I do is in San Diego and in California, so I apologize if it doesn't fully translate. I might talk about some things that are specific to the US, but I'm happy to answer questions and to get resources to you if you need them. So I'm going to share my screen. And if I have any technical difficulties, somebody just let me know in the chat. And if you have questions along the way, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat as well. Give me 1 second to do this, and I'm assuming you all can see that PowerPoint. So today I just wanted to talk to you about the essential work of nonprofit boards as it relates to fundraising, and just give you some background and some things to think about, and to maybe give you some ideas for breaking through any difficulties that you might be having. So by all means, introduce yourself in the chat if you want, and any board member experience that you may have, if you'd like to share that. I like to set the backdrop to tell people stuff, practitioners especially, things you probably already know. And nonprofits are extremely complex organizations, even the smallest ones, where multiple stakeholders want different things from different people. And sometimes, even though we all believe in the mission, how we get to that mission is sometimes not something that everybody agrees on. So ironing out that complexity is an issue that leaders, and especially governing boards, have to deal with. The other place that adds some tension is, in our work, those who receive the services are not always the ones who pay for the services. So sometimes when you're fundraising and donors want to give you money for something, and your constituents or the people that you serve need something else, being able to pull those two things together and not be forced to do things in your community that you don't want to do just because a donor wants to give you money to do it. And how you navigate that is sort of the the leadership element of nonprofit work. Nonprofit work is also, I tell people, really difficult because of the shared decision making. Nobody gets to make a decision in a vacuum. My sister owns her own for-profit business, so if she wants to change her product line tomorrow, she can. She doesn't have to ask anybody. But if a nonprofit or an NGO wants to change what they're doing, they have to work together. Committees have to meet, and boards have to make decisions, and staff have to agree. So the shared decision making sometimes makes what is the gem of our sector, a democratic process, sometimes makes it look messy, and to outsiders makes it look not efficient or effective. But it is a way that we do business. And then ultimately, getting everyone on the same page in terms of governance is a critical role. And it takes leadership. So from the board chair, from the staff, from everybody who's on the board to get, to try to get to the same place, and to some level of consensus or agreement. And then I like to remind people that, nonprofits are part of a much larger complex system, and we see a lot of work around this. Sometimes I think boards focus only on their organization and the needs of their organization without understanding the larger ecosystem. So the more the board can understand where they fit into the work that they're doing, the easier I think it will be for them to fundraise, to do their work. And so sometimes giving the board more education on the larger ecosystem is an important thing to do. So this is my metaphor for governance in good times, right? You set the course, you smooth sailing, you're looking as a board member way out into the future and thinking about how you're going to move, in this case, this boat from here to there, and gently moving the tiller to make, minor adjustments. This picture is how I felt about governance during a worldwide pandemic and over the last couple of years, right? Everything was very reactionary, turbulent, and lots of the word pivot being used. The ways the nonprofits earned their money, much of that was shut off to them very quickly at the beginning of the pandemic. Those that hadn't invested in online fundraising opportunities prior, I think, lagged behind. And so ultimately, we want our boards to be helping our organizations to adapt to changes in both the internal and the external environment. There's a little cartoon about what happens if you don't adapt. And boards can really play that position by understanding the external environment and bringing in that knowledge and information to the organization and being kind of that listening post while the organization is busy doing the work on the ground and obviously knows the community and the people being served really well. The board can bring in and expand the knowledge of the organization by bringing in, a rich source, a rich vision and a skill set that broadens the capacity of the organization. And helps it grow. Okay, go to the next slide. And then lastly, I like to say, this is what I say to everyone when I'm talking about governance, no matter what the topic is. So I'm just giving this background right now. But boards also have to be the guardians of values. And that's that piece, especially in the fundraising piece, where if somebody's asking you to do something and they're willing to give you money for it, does it align with your values? This gets back to key decisions that, at least in the US, nonprofits are having to make, for example, around investments, or in several states in the US, marijuana has become legal, and nonprofit boards are struggling with, well, do we want to take donations from organizations that sell marijuana? And it's just a values question. There's not a clear answer to that question, but these are the kinds of conversations that boards get to have, and I think it's kind of nice that you get to think about and make decisions based on values more so than just the bottom line of the organization. So ultimately, if we're going to talk about governance, we're going to talk about what is governance. So here's an academic definition of governance, but I've highlighted some topics, some words that I think really kind of get to the end of it, right? And, a lot of times I'll ask people, we don't have time today, but I'll ask people that are in the room, if you're a board member, think of the first time you went to a board meeting, right? And you can all do that for just a second now. What did you think the first time you went to a board meeting? Well, you thought, how did you know what to do? Did somebody give you a rule book? Most likely you watched other people around you and started to follow whatever the process of the group was. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right way to govern, right? So there is a whole body of literature and lots of things you can do to improve your performance as board members. There's this political element of it that is interesting, not in the negative sense of the word political, but definitely sorting things out and getting people on to the same page. A lot of times I'll ask folks to say, what do you think governing is? And I'll get a lot of things like oversight, accountability, fiduciary responsibility, things like that. And that is part of governance or fundraising. Those are all parts of the roles of the board, but the role of the board is much more complex than any just one thing. And governance, here's just another definition, right? So if you're really narrow-minded and you think the only piece is to do auditing and accountability, well, you're missing the opportunity to engage in policy, strategy, insight, give insight, wisdom, judgment, those kinds of things. So I think the broader definition is really quite helpful. I want to talk for just a minute about what research in the US anyway says about governance right now. This is research that we were doing at the University of San Diego. So diversity in board leadership is quite is not where it needs to be. This has been a conversation that's been going on for 10 years at least, and probably more. But for example, in San Diego, where I live, 55% of our residents identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color. But that proportion of the population is not fully represented on our nonprofit boards and in our nonprofit staff. And so that's something that we're working on. That's the chart at the top. The chart at the bottom tells us that people are willing to discuss what we call issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're struggling to implement strategies. So this is just, there's no answer to this. This is just the state of where we are in terms of governance and what people are working on. In terms of gender, although the sector in the US is made up primarily of women, about 75%, men still dominate the leadership roles. And as boards in the US get bigger in terms of budget size, the proportion of women goes down. So the richer the organization, the less gender diversity is in the organization. And then lastly, I want to provide you with, in the US, we have two sources of information that I like to use when thinking about boards that are kind of leading thought leaders. One is Board Source, and the other is called Board Effect. Board Source and Board Effect. And the research that Board Source did this summer showed that boards are disconnected from the communities, the people they serve, and lack diversity, often ill-informed about their ecosystem. And then for today's purposes, I'm just going to mention the third one, too focused on fundraising at the expense of strategy, relevance, and impact. So does this mean that we shouldn't focus on fundraising on boards? No, of course we should focus on that, but not solely. And sometimes I think if we're not careful, we can make board members feel like their only job is to raise money and write a check. And that's probably a sure strategy for losing good board members. So you want to also keep your eye on the ball of strategy, relevance, and impact. Okay. In the US, we have legal responsibilities, and so I leave this in here across the US that are captured under these three topics. Boards must undertake the duty of care, loyalty, and obedience, which is basically exercise power in the best interest of the organization, avoid conflicts of interest and self-dealing, employ good basic business-like practices, and follow the law. So, I mean, there's not a lot of legal requirements around what boards do and how they take up their work, but these three duties are definitely at the heart of all nonprofit boards in the US anyway. Board Source puts forward 10 key responsibilities of nonprofit boards. You can just take a look at this. This has been out for a long time. Sometimes I think people are surprised by some of these because they've never really thought that these are their kinds of things they should be enacting. And this is a good place if you want to have a conversation with your board you can assess yourself against these things and say, well, how good am I doing? How good are we at doing financial oversight, ensuring resources, etc. So I'm going to take a little deeper dive. Oh, and then what I always get asked when I do board governance stuff is, well, how do I stay out of trouble? At least in the US, this is true. Conscientious performance is the standard. So you can make a bad decision as a board as long as you have a thoughtful process for making the bad decision. So that means you take your minutes, you record any objections, you vote. And so the collective decision-making and the documentation of that is your protection. And we can talk more about that if there's questions. People ask me regularly, what is how my board is so disengaged. I can't get them to do anything, right? Well, there's a framework for governance that's in a book called Governance is Leadership. And I'm just going to offer this up for just a second. And authors explain that they classified governance in three buckets, right? The fiduciary, the strategic, and the generative. And you can see on this slide what kind of happens under each of those. Their point is, and my point to you is, if you're putting all of your board member efforts into the first bucket, the fiduciary and oversight piece, board members are not going to be engaged. Yes, you have to do that work, but only doing that work is not really all that interesting or fun over time. If you've been on a board, you know what I'm talking about. So it's much more engaging to talk about strategy and to think about values and challenges and logic. And so the more you can build up board activities that get your board working into these two areas, you have the recipe for engagement success. People are automatically engaged when they're learning together, right? So the board's role in fundraising, there's probably a lot of other things, but these are the things I wanted to mention today. I think it's really important that board set fundraising goals that are realistic, that you know, how do you achieve a goal if you don't know what it is, right? And then figure out the strategy for how you're going to help your staff get to that goal. I think it's also really important that boards question the fundraising efficiency. So I see a lot of organizations waste money on raising money. So they'll spend 50 cents to earn $1. So really, and sometimes it's because a lot of times it's around special events and things that they've always done, right? Well, we can't not have our black tie gala party or our golf tournament or whatever because we've always done it. Well, maybe there's a more efficient way to raise money, especially through the use of technology. Ultimately, board members in terms of fundraising have to show up. Whatever the organization's doing, they're cutting a ribbon, they're having a you know, a soiree, they're having a meeting. Board members need to be there, I think, with their name tags on, and they need to be greeting people, talking about the mission, and being good ambassadors. Using connections to bring resources to the organization. So you don't just leave your good connections at the door, you bring them in, you talk about your organization all the time to your colleagues and friends. There's work in the sector. A lot of organizations have what we call a give or get policy. In the US, it's becoming much more normal to have an expectation that all board members give at least something. And some organizations have ridiculous dollar sums and others don't. But the main thing is, if you're not going to make a financial investment, even if it's $5, if you're not as a board member, why would anybody else? And a lot of times board members will say, well, I'm giving my time. You know what? You got to put a little more into that. So we call it give, get, or get off. So maybe, you know, the board I'm on, you know, they want me to either bring in, you know, X amount. They either want me to give X amount of dollars, or they want me to go get it, like either sell some tickets or you know, whatever, help them, or get off the board. And then I think you have to be realistic about your personal resources. So if somebody's asking you to come on a board and you say, well, how much do you want me to help you fundraise? I think if you can't bring, let's say, $10,000 to the table or $200, whatever the number is, I think you just have to be really realistic about what you can bring. Well, I can't do this, but I can do these things, because there's nothing worse than sitting on a board that you feel like you're not contributing to. So in the end, good governance is really a balancing act between all of those things. And I just have like 2 more slides and then I'll stop sharing and I can take questions. Ultimately, in terms of all this work, I like to remind board members what they don't do, right? And these are some of those things, because we call that getting into the weeds. And if you have a staffed organization, if you're all volunteer run, then forget it. You have to do all these things too. And then I think it's really important for board members to set up processes that encourage thoughtful inquiry and play the role of critical friend, right? If you just what we call in the US, rubber stamp everything, the organization isn't going to grow. But if you're always critical, it's going to be a miserable place to be. So you want to strike that balance as a critical friend to raise important issues. I think listening to what we would call your gut, or listening to your conscience, is important. If it sounds like a bad idea, it probably is a bad idea. And you should probably bring that up. But I think at the board, one of the best things board members can do is ask helpful questions. And then don't forget to have fun, because board service, I think, is an honor and a privilege and should be fun. And I'm going to stop sharing because I feel like I can't see anybody. Excuse me 1 second. There we go. So, thank you. I was talking as fast as I can. I'm 4 minutes over, so I apologize. And I know you may have to go to other places. but I'm happy to stay. I think Victoria is going to put me into another room and answer some questions. My last parting thought is, yes, the board is critical in fundraising, but it is not their only job. So find meaningful work for board members to do, and then they'll be really happy to fundraise for you. So it's kind of my take on it. Victoria, anything else I can help you with? Or if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. You are muted, Miss Victoria.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is very informative, and I'm sure a lot of people have learned. And thank you. I'm going to put you on a lounge now, and people can kind of ask you a question. And thank you so much for your time. If you want to meet with Laura one-on-one, please stay at the end right now. You're going to meet with Laura at the lounge, and then she can ask her your question. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Laura.
Of course. I'm just going to go wherever you send me now.
Yes, of course.
Okay.